Welcome to the Underclass Podcast with Austin Picard. I'm an independent researcher who can't stomach being lied to on a daily basis by the mainstream media, while we live in a fracturing society, launched into parallel realities, falling perfectly onto the two sides of the political spectrum. I remain in the underclass. Every scandal since Watergate has often been facetiously labeled with the same terminology or gate suffix in a deceitful and underhanded attempt to convince the vast majority of people to inherently dismiss these abhorrent crimes of state, intentionally conflating them by analogy with the infamous Watergate scandal. Yet again, we're forcefully confronted with an all too familiar emotional state of fear and loathing generated by the shadow cabal pulling the strings, as we find it within ourselves to ask the inevitable question: what is the real story behind the Watergate scandal? The one duty we owe to history, said Oscar Wilde, is to rewrite it.
This is a CBS News special report, The Embattled President, with CBS News correspondent Roger Mudd.
Richard Nixon's future as the President of the United States has now apparently moved beyond his control. Despite his own considerable powers as chief executive, his future is really in the hands of the other two branches of government, the courts and the Congress. The federal courts have uncovered a bizarre system of handling the tape recordings of the president's meetings and phone calls, carelessly stored and checked in and out in a strange fashion. And now, further straining credulity, the White House says two of the tapes never existed. On Capitol Hill, the House Judiciary Committee has started a formal inquiry into whether it should approve the impeachment of the president. The Senate Judiciary Committee is hearing proposals that would shift control of the Watergate investigation from the White House to a court-appointed prosecutor who could investigate the president himself. The Senate Rules Committee is now questioning House Republican leader Gerald Ford as if he would soon be president, demanding answers on executive privilege, on releasing documents, on obstructing justice, on his personal finances, on his medical and health records. The public opinion polls, always a revered source of comfort and pleasure for the president, have now turned sour. A year ago, Gallup said 68% approved Mr. Nixon. Yesterday, the figure fell to 27%. And during this past week, the president began hearing the clamor to resign on the editorial pages of his friendliest publishers in Denver, in Atlanta, in Detroit. Added to this domestic firestorm, the president also was involved with a dangerous military confrontation in the Middle East, which carries the potential of a face-off between the United States and the Soviet Union. But the man closest to the president, Alexander Haig, insisted in an interview with Dan Rather this morning that Mr. Nixon is working efficiently and has no intention of resigning. Tonight, Barry Goldwater, one of the president's oldest friends who has been sharply critical of Mr. Nixon's conduct on Watergate, called for a period of restraint and reflection to quiet the hysteria about the president. Central to the problems faced by President Nixon is the Watergate tapes and their tangled history. Fred Graham traces that story.
It all began suddenly last July when an obscure former White House official named Alexander Butterfield appeared as a surprise witness before the Senate Watergate Committee.
Butterfield, are you aware of the installation of any listening devices in the Oval Office of the President?
I was aware of listening devices. Yes, sir.
The committee voted unanimously to ask President Nixon to turn over the tapes. The president replied by letter. The tapes, which have been under my sole personal control, will remain so. None has been transcribed or made public, and none will be. So on July 23rd, lawyers for the Senate committee appeared at the Executive Office building adjacent to the White House to serve two subpoenas upon Richard Nixon through his lawyers. One subpoena for the tapes, another for related documents. Later that day, another subpoena for the tapes was served on the president through his lawyers. This one, a grand jury subpoena obtained by Special Watergate prosecutor Archibald Cox. The case was set for hearing before Judge John Sirica, the strong-minded 69-year-old trial judge who had precipitated the Watergate crisis by refusing to believe that nobody higher up than the original 7 Watergate defendants had been involved. President Nixon stated the reasons for not turning over the tapes that were later to be translated into constitutional arguments.
It is even more important that the confidentiality of conversations between a president and his advisors be protected. This is no mere luxury to be dispensed with whenever a particular issue raises sufficient uproar. It is absolutely essential to the conduct of the presidency in this and in all future administrations.
Judge Sirica ordered the president to surrender the tapes, and the Court of Appeals, in a 5-2 decision, supported Sirica. Both courts said the grand jury needed the tapes to decide which high officials might have been involved in the Watergate break-in and cover-up. Judge Sirica specifically asked for recordings of 9 different conversations, seeking the answers to questions raised by the testimony of witnesses before the Senate Watergate Committee this past summer.
I told Senator Baker, I believe, the other day that Watergate was not discussed at that meeting, and since then I have rechecked what sketchy notes I have, and I find I was in error on that. I'm sure there must have been some discussion of the Watergate with the president on that occasion on the 20th.
I told the president about the fact that there was no money to pay these individuals to meet their demands. He asked me how much it would cost. I told him I could only make an estimate that it might be as high as $1 million or more. He told me that that was no problem. He also looked over at Haldeman and repeated the same statement.
Nixon attempted to end the controversy with a bold stroke. He said he would not appeal to the Supreme Court, then made a compromise offer of summaries of the tapes and fired the special prosecutor for refusing to agree. But a storm of opinion erupted against this, and Nixon's lawyer made a surprise announcement.
I've just informed Judge Sirica that President Nixon will comply in all respects with the order of this court as modified by the Court of Appeals. This president does not defy the law.
The nation barely had time to heave a sigh of relief before lawyers were scurrying into Judge Sirica's court again, this time to confront the most startling development yet in the long story of the tapes. A lawyer for the president, Fred Bazart, declared that it was discovered only last weekend that 2 key conversations were never recorded. He told Judge Sirica that the president's phone call to John Mitchell on June the 20th, their first conversation after Watergate, was placed from a phone that was not bugged, and that when Mr. Nixon had his controversial talk with John Dean on April 15th, the recorder had run out of tape. So there is no way to check the truth of what the Watergate witnesses said about these conversations.
On the 20th of June, when I talked to him, I apologized to him for not knowing what the hell had happened, and I should have kept a stronger hand on what the people in the committee were doing, etc.
I informed the president that I had told the prosecutors of my own involvement and the involvement of others. The president recalled the fact that at one point we had discussed the difficulty in raising money, and that he said that $1 million was nothing to raise to pay to maintain the silence for the defendants. He said that he had, of course, only been joking when he made that comment. The most interesting thing that happened during the conversation was very near the end. He got up out of his chair, went behind the chair to the corner of the executive office building office, and in a nearly audible tone said to me, he was probably foolish to have discussed Hunt's clemency with Colson.
In the hearing before Judge Sirica, White House personnel testified that only one recorder with 6 hours of tape was in operation on the weekend of the Nixon-Dean conversation, and Bazart was able to show that Nixon had been talking with aides for far more than 6 hours before Dean entered the room. But the White House's handling of the tapes and its record-keeping was so sloppy that there was no way to prove the tapes hadn't been destroyed. Records were kept on scraps of paper torn from shopping bags, and nobody had checked to see if tapes loaned to former presidential aide H.R. Haldeman had all been returned. Finally, the president's special assistant, Stephen Bull, testified that he had told Mr. Nixon 5 weeks ago that the 2 tapes could not be found, and as Bull put it, I don't recall any comment by the president in response to that. Judge Sirica's inquiry into the missing tapes still has a week to run, but even before all the facts are in, a revealing pattern has emerged. The weight of the evidence so far is that the 2 conversations probably were not recorded, but that the White House knew of this weeks or even months ago, not last weekend when Mr. Nixon's spokesman told the court and the public the absence was discovered. And it appears to be a measure of Mr. Nixon's troubles that public attention has tended to focus on the holes in the White House's story, not its consistencies. Again and again last week, observers in the courtroom were heard to say, you know, the White House could be telling the truth, but nobody will ever believe it. Fred Graham, CBS News, Washington.
The brilliant Jim Hogan, author of Secret Agenda, Watergate, Deep Throat, and the CIA, originally published in 1984, provides us with the perfect introduction to an event that seemingly reverberates throughout history. Our story begins in the early morning hours of June 17, 1972. 5 men were arrested in the Watergate headquarters of the Democratic National Committee, DNC. Wearing business suits and surgical gloves, they were in possession of bugging devices and photographic equipment. Within 24 hours, police and FBI agents established links between the arrested men, the Committee to Re-elect the President, CRP, and the Nixon White House. In the meantime, a political cover-up had already begun. Evidence was shredded and burned, perjury contemplated, and justice obstructed by some of the most important officials in the U.S. government. Despite this, and despite the administration's efforts to depict the break-in as a third-rate burglary, unworthy of attention, the story stuck tenaciously to the front pages of liberal newspapers throughout the United States. During that summer and fall, the press, and in particular the Washington Post, pursued the issue in an alleged effort to learn the extent and nature of the administration's dirty tricks and the identities of those responsible for them. As the president's re-election neared, it became increasingly difficult for those involved to stonewall the press. An employee of one of the arrested men told the FBI that he had monitored some 200 telephone calls emanating from the DNC, which he claimed had been bugged for the first time in May of 1972. With the guidance of an anonymous source nicknamed Deep Throat, Washington Post reporters rattled the White House with a barrage of front-page articles about secret campaign funds, vicious campaign practices, and much more. Soon, a Senate Select Committee was convened to explore the affair, and one of the first witnesses that it heard was a former CIA officer named James McCord. A turncoat in the eyes of his accomplices, McCord was one of the men arrested in the Watergate. Infuriated by the Nixon administration's handling of the affair and fearful of receiving a draconian sentence, McCord had written a letter to the judge who presided over the criminal case against the original defendants. In that letter, McCord wrote that perjury had been committed, that there were other conspirators who were yet to be named, and that political pressure had been applied to ensure the silence of those under arrest. McCord promised to tell all, and soon afterward, so did White House officials such as John Dean. Finally, after a succession of damaging revelations and the enforced resignation of subordinates, the president was hoisted by his own petard. The existence of a secret White House taping system was revealed, and with it, Nixon's complicity in the cover-up. On August 8, 1974, he announced his resignation as President of the United States.
Good morning. This is Today in Washington, Friday, August 9th. The nation awaits the swearing in at noon Eastern Time of our 38th President, Gerald Ford, and the departure from political life of Richard M. Nixon. In a televised farewell last night, President Nixon acknowledged that because of the Watergate affair, he no longer has a strong enough base in Congress to continue with any effectiveness. He and his family are expected to leave by air for their home in California later this morning, and we expect to see their departure from the White House. I'm Barbara Walters with Jim Hartz.
Good morning.
Good morning, Jim. And we will have fuller details on this momentous story in just a moment, a story that many of us are still having trouble believing actually occurred. Later in this half hour, we will look back on film at that incident, that so-called caper, seemingly so minor at the time, that led to the events which culminated last night. We're talking about the Watergate break-in and the widening cast of characters that swept the events along.
Also in this hour, Edmund Newman will report on the background and character of Gerald Ford. We will speak with House Speaker Carl Albert, who for the second time in less than 10 months will become first in line to succeed a president, in this case, President Ford. We'll also look inside the White House at President Nixon and his closest advisors at the height of their power and prestige. But first, before any of this morning's news. At mid-morning today, the President will say goodbye to the White House staff in a Rose Garden ceremony, then leave Washington on an Air Force jet bound for his home in San Clemente, California. His resignation as the 37th President of the United States takes effect at noon today, Eastern Time, and at that moment, in the Oval Office, Vice President Gerald Ford will be sworn in as the 38th Chief Executive. There is here in Washington a great sense of relief and hope that the turmoil of the last 2 years is over at last. Here is part of what the President said in his resignation speech last night.
I have never been a quitter. To leave office before my term is completed is abhorrent to every instinct in my body. But as President, I must put the interests of America first. America needs a full-time President and a full-time Congress, particularly at this time with problems we face at home and abroad, to continue to fight through the months ahead for my personal vindication would almost totally absorb the time and attention of both the President and the Congress in a period when our entire focus should be on the great issues of peace abroad and prosperity without inflation at home. Therefore, I shall resign the presidency effective at noon tomorrow. Vice President Ford will be sworn in as president at that hour in this office.
Public reaction to that announcement was a mixture of jubilation on the part of Nixon's enemies and relief on the part of his friends. For nearly 2 years, the country had been blitzed by the minutiae of Watergate and force-fed the images of increasingly uninteresting men. Was there anyone left who did not consider himself a reluctant expert on the subject? Probably not. A private detective named Lewis J. Russell, an alcoholic and a womanizer, Russell had been one of the country's foremost red hunters during the 1950s, while a top staff member of the House Committee on Un-American Activities, a notorious HUAC. In researching the sordid details of Russell's life, I soon learned of his employment by McCord and, what's more, of his presence at the Watergate break-in on the night of the arrests. Hogan continues to explain that, in an attempt to understand what Russell was doing there on that momentous evening, I studied the break-in with more attentiveness than the authorities themselves had displayed a decade earlier. Because the burglars had been caught in the act, the burglary itself had not seemed to warrant intensive investigation. The best efforts of the press, the Senate, and subsequently the special prosecutor were therefore applied to questions of political responsibility and culpability in the cover-up. For that reason, many questions about the break-in had been left unanswered, not the least of which was its true purpose. Hogan asserted that, eventually I was able to answer some of these questions by interviewing men and women whose evidence had been ignored. These were not, for the most part, White House officials or cabinet members, but lowly workers at the DNC, waitresses and maintenance men at the Watergate, landladies, secretaries, cops, neighbors, desk clerks, and security guards. The details they provided led to a picture of the Watergate break-in that was far different from what had been transmitted via television at the time. Besides those interviews, I was able to obtain, through the Freedom of Information Act, literally thousands of pages of FBI documents pertaining to Watergate. These included interviews, laboratory reports, summaries, chronologies, airtels, photographs, and telephone records. Most of this material, indeed almost all of it, was never available to the Senate's Irvin Committee. An internal memorandum of the FBI states that the only information we furnish to that committee is the opportunity to review FD 302s of interviews conducted during the McCord investigation, Such FD 302s must be specified by the name of the person interviewed and are made available only for review, not copying. In effect, the FBI investigation of the Watergate affair was off limits except on the most restricted basis to the very committee that sat in judgment of the Nixon administration. Clearly, the Senate's conclusions and American history would have been radically different if the Bureau's findings had been shared more freely at the time. I was the first outsider then to get an inside look at the FBI's Watergate investigation, and what I found was startling. Nixon's 70% approval rating leading up to the scandal left many people scratching their heads as to the real reason he would take such a risk to acquire dirt on any political opponent. Nevertheless, the most fundamental premise of the affair had always been that White House spies bugged the Democrats in their headquarters at the Watergate complex, apparently to gain political intelligence. FBI documents, however, and other evidence that was either ignored or overlooked by Senate committees, prosecutors, and the press, show conclusively that telephones in the Watergate offices of the Democratic National Committee were never bugged. False evidence in the form of a crude defunct bugging device was planted inside the DNC months after the Watergate arrests, so as to conceal the truth about the affair. Further investigation showed that G. Gordon Liddy, the ostensible leader of the espionage team, was in actuality a dupe of his subordinates E. Howard Hunt and James McCord. Hunt and McCord were secretly working for the CIA while using the White House as a cover for domestic intelligence operations that, in Hunt's case, included spying upon the administration he had sworn to serve. Clients of prostitutes in the Columbia Plaza apartments, hard by the Watergate complex, were the real targets of the bugging operation. Watergate, then, was not so much a partisan political scandal as it was secretly a sex scandal, the unpredictable outcome of a CIA operation that, in the simplest of terms, tripped on its own shoelaces. There is much more, much more. The point is made. Our recent history is a forgery, the byproduct of secret agents acting on secret agendas of their own. What follows does not pretend to be a definitive account of the Watergate affair. On the contrary, it is simply an attempt to correct the record insofar as it is possible to do so, and to suggest avenues of further investigation. Inevitably, because evidence has been destroyed and the accounts of witnesses are often in direct conflict with one another, it sometimes happens that issues of apparent importance to the scandal cannot be resolved. We have Chief Plumber David Young's word, for example, that the Moore Radford spy scandal is of particular importance in understanding the Watergate affair. Unfortunately, however, Young has sworn not to discuss the matter, with the result that our account of the Moore Radford matter ends on an inconclusive note. In a similar way, CIA's intensive surveillance of columnist Jack Anderson, culminating in a meeting at which Anderson and CIA Director Richard Helms both appear to have been spied on, become increasingly mysterious rather than less so the more one studies it. Why did the agency terminate its surveillance at the very moment that Hunt, Liddy, and a supposedly retired CIA physician were meeting to discuss ways of terminating the columnist himself? A third cul-de-sac concerns certain events that occurred in Washington on the night of May 26, 1972, the night of the so-called banquet break-in. The only conclusion that one can fairly reach after studying the evidence is that the subject is important enough for more than one person to lie about it. Finally, there are general questions to which no specific answer suggests itself. For example, to what extent did conflicts within the U.S. intelligence community or schisms between American foreign policy makers contribute to President Nixon's downfall? Or were those rivalries no more than trace elements in the poisonous atmosphere in which Nixon's downfall happened to occur? In the absence of the power to subpoena testimony and evidence, a power not usually available to authors, These questions are unlikely ever to be answered. Still, they must be asked if we are to understand the dimensions of the mystery we have come to study. For this reason, then, we must occasionally embark upon a puzzle that we cannot solve. My hope, then, is that this will lead to the formation of a new, nonpartisan commission of inquiry. Clearly, the whole truth will become known only through the efforts of such a panel, one armed with subpoena powers and with access to evidence that, until now, has been unavailable, i.e., to the Watergate files of the FBI and the CIA. Jim Hogan's efforts to obtain access to certain CIA documents pertinent to the Watergate affair have been frustrated by the agency's procrastination. A Freedom of Information Act request filed by Hogan with the National Archives was referred to the CIA years ago. Though the agency claims that it has nothing to hide where Watergate is concerned, it has yet to release a single requested document or to cite any FOIA exemptions for having failed to do so. A much more recent report by James Rosen, published at Real Clear Politics, revealed that still more evidence emerged regarding Watergate in CIA documents released in November 2017 in one of the final rounds of declassification mandated under the President John F. Kennedy Assassination Records Collection Act of 1992. The long-suppressed JFK files, as the news media dubbed them, included several hundred pages from Howard Hunt's CIA personnel file, all previously unreported until now. Eugenio Martinez was one of the burglars arrested at the Watergate Hotel in 1972. His account of the burglary was first published in Vanity Fair magazine in 1974. He begins by claiming that we Cubans have never stopped fighting for the liberation of our country. I have personally carried out over 350 missions to Cuba for the CIA. Some of the people I infiltrated there were caught and tortured, and some of them talked. My mother and father were not allowed to leave Cuba. It would have been easy for me to get them out. That was my specialty. But my bosses in the company, the CIA, said I might get caught and tortured, and if I talked, I might jeopardize other operations. So my mother and father died in Cuba. That is how orders go. I follow the orders. I can't help seeing the whole Watergate affair as a repetition of the Bay of Pigs. The invasion was a fiasco for the United States and a tragedy for the Cubans. All of the agencies of the U.S. government were involved, and they carried out their plans in so ill a manner that everyone landed in the hands of Castro like a present. Eduardo was a name that all of us who had participated in the Bay of Pigs knew well. He had been the maximum representative of the Kennedy administration to our people in Miami. He occupied a special place in our hearts because of a letter he had written to his chief Cuban aide and my lifelong friend Bernard Barker. He had identified himself in his letter with the pain of the Cubans, and he blamed the Kennedy administration for not supporting us on the beaches of the Bay of Pigs. So when Barker told me that Eduardo was coming to town, that he wanted to meet me, that was like a hope for me. He had chosen to meet us at the Bay of Pigs monument, where we commemorate our dead on April 16, 1971, the 10th anniversary of the invasion. I always go to the monument on that day, but that year I had another purpose, to meet Eduardo, the famous Eduardo, in person. He was different from all the other men I had met in the company. He looked more like a politician than a man who was fighting for freedom. He was there with his pipe, relaxing in front of the memorial, and Barker introduced me. I then learned his name for the first time, Howard Hunt. There was something strange about this man. His tan, is not the tan of a man who is in the sun. His motions are very meticulous, the way he smokes his pipe, the way he looks at you and smiles. He knows how to make you happy. He's very warm, but at the same time, you can sense that he does not go all into you, or you all into him. We went to a Cuban restaurant for lunch, and right away, Eduardo told us that he had retired from the CIA in 1971 and was working for Mullen and Company. I knew just what he was saying. I was also officially retired from the company. 2 years before, my case officer had gathered all the men in my company unit and handed us envelopes with retirement announcements inside, but mine was a blank paper. Afterward, he explained to me that I would stop making my boat missions to Cuba, but I would continue my work with the company. He said I should become an American citizen, and soon I would be given a new assignment. Not even Barker knew that I was still working with the company, but I was quite certain that day that Eduardo knew. We talked about the liberation of Cuba, and he assured us that the whole thing is not over. Then he started inquiring, "What is Manolo doing?" Manolo was the leader of the Bay of Pigs operation. "What is Roman doing?" Roman was the other leader. He said he wanted to meet with the old people. It was a good sign. We did not think he had come to Miami for nothing. Generally, I talked to my CIA case officer at least twice a week, and maybe on the phone another 2 times. I told him right away that Eduardo was back in town, and that I had had lunch with him. Anytime anyone from the CIA was in town, my CO always asked me what he was doing, but he didn't ask me anything about Eduardo, which was strange. That was in April. In the middle of July, Eduardo wrote to Barker to tell him he was in the White House as a counselor to the president. He sent a number of memos to us on White House stationery, and that was very impressive, you know. So I went back to my CO and said to him, "Hey, Eduardo is still in contact with us, and now he is a counselor of the president." A few days later, my CO told me that the company had no information on Eduardo except that he was not working in the White House. Well, imagine. I knew Eduardo was in the White House. What it meant to me was that Eduardo was above them, and either they weren't supposed to know what he was doing, or they didn't want me to talk about him anymore. Knowing how these people act, I knew I had to be careful. So I said, well, let me keep my mouth shut. Not long after this, Eduardo told Barker there was a job, a national security job dealing with a traitor of this country who had given papers to the Russian embassy. He said they were forming a group with the CIA, the FBI, and all the agencies, and that it was to be directed from within the White House, with jurisdiction to operate where all the others did not fit. Barker said Eduardo needed 2 more individuals, and he had thought of me. Would I like my name submitted for clearance? I said yes. To me, this was a great honor. I believed it was the result of my sacrifice for the previous 10 years, from my work with the company. In that time, I had carried out hundreds of missions for the U.S. government. All of them had been covert, and most were very dangerous. 3 or 4 days later, Barker told me my name had been cleared, and several weeks after that came the first assignment. "Get clothes for 2 or 3 days and be ready tomorrow," he said. "We're leaving for the operation." Barker didn't tell me where we were going, and I did not ask. I was an operative. I couldn't afford to be aware of more sensitive information than was critical for the success of my mission. There would be times when I would take men wearing hoods to Cuba. They might have been my friends, but I did not want to know. Too many of my friends have been caught and tortured and forced to talk. In this kind of work, you learn to lose your curiosity. So it was not until I got to the airport in Miami that I discovered we were going to Los Angeles. There were 3 of us on the mission. The third man, Felipe de Diego, was a real estate partner of ours. He is an old company man and a Bay of Pigs veteran whom we knew we could trust. In all my years in this country, I had never been out of the Miami area before that day. I had always been on 24-hour call. I kind of expected my CO to ask where I was going, but he simply said it was fine for me to take a few days off. There wasn't much to do at the time. I sort of thought he did not want to know what I was doing. We stayed at the Beverly Hills Hotel and met in Eduardo's room for our only briefing. As we walked in, I noticed the equipment devices to modify the voice, wigs and fake glasses, false identification. Eduardo told us all these things belonged to the company. Barker recognized the name on Hunt's false identification, Edward J. Hamilton, It's the same cover name Eduardo had used during the Bay of Pigs. The briefing was not like anything I was used to in the company. Ordinarily, before an operation, you have a briefing, and then you train for the operation. You try to find a place that looks similar, and you train in disguise and with the code you are going to use. You try out the plan many times so that later you have the elasticity to abort the operation if the conditions are not ideal. Eduardo's briefing was not like this. There wasn't a written plan, not even any mention of what to do if something went wrong. There was just the man talking about the thing. We were to get into an office to take photographs of psychiatric records of a traitor. I was to be the photographer. The next day, we went to Sears and bought some little hats and uniforms for Barker and Felipe. They were supposed to dress up as delivery men and deliver the photographic equipment inside the office. Later that night, we would break in and complete the mission. They looked kind of queerish when they put on the clothes, the Peter Lorre type glasses and the funny Dita beard wigs. But that was not my responsibility, so I waited in the car while they went to the office of Dr. Fielding to deliver the package. Just before leaving, Barker had whispered to me, "Hey, remember this name, Ellsberg." Daniel Ellsberg was a military analyst who, while employed by the Rand Corporation, became a whistleblower and helped facilitate the end of the Vietnam War by releasing a top-secret Pentagon study of U.S. government decision-making in relation to the war effort. Eduardo had told him the name, and he told me because he was worried he would forget it. The name meant nothing to me. Barker and Felipe were supposed to put the bag inside the office, unlatch the back door, and come out. After the cleaning lady left, we were to go back in. Now, it happened that we had to wait for hours and hours because no one had figured out when the cleaning woman would leave. Finally, I believe a gentleman came in a car and picked her up. So at last, we went to open the door. And what happened? The door was locked. Barker went around to see if the other door was open, and after a long wait, he still did not show up. We didn't know what to do. There had been another man in the briefing the night before in Eduardo's room who hadn't said anything. Later, I learned it was probably Gordon Liddy, but at the time I only knew him as George. Just at that moment, he came up to us and said, "Okay, you people go ahead and force one of the windows and go in." Eduardo had given us a small crowbar and a glass cutter. I tried to cut the glass, but it wouldn't cut. It was bad. Bad. It would not cut anything. So then I taped the window and I hit it with this very small crowbar, and I put my hand in and unlocked the window. According to the police, we were using gloves and didn't leave any fingerprints. But I'm afraid that I did because I didn't wear my gloves when I put the tape on the window, you know? Sometimes it's hard to use gloves. I went all through the offices with my bare hands, but I used my handkerchief to wipe off the prints. Inside the doctor's office, we covered the windows and took out the equipment. Really, it was a joke. They had given us a rope to bail out from a second floor if anyone surprised us. It was so small, it couldn't have supported any of us. This was nothing new. It's what the company did in the Bay of Pigs when they gave us old ships, old planes, and old weapons. They explained that if you were caught in one of those operations with commercial weapons that you could buy anywhere, you could be said to be on your own. They teach you that they are going to disavow you. The company teaches you to accept those things as the efficient way to work, and we were grateful. Otherwise, we wouldn't have had any help at all. In this operation, it seemed obvious. They didn't want it traced back to the White House. Eduardo told us that if we were caught, we should say we were addicts looking for drugs. I had just set up the photographic equipment when we heard a noise. We were afraid. Then we heard Barker's familiar knock and we let him in. I took a Polaroid picture of the office before we started looking for the Ellsberg papers so we could put everything back just as it was before. But there was nothing of Ellsberg's there. There was nothing about psychiatry, not one file of sick people, only bills. It looked like an import-export office more than a psychiatrist's. The only thing with the name of Ellsberg in it was the doctor's telephone book. I took a photo of this so that we could bring something back. Before leaving, I took some pills from Dr. Fielding's briefcase. Vitamin C, I think. and spread them all over the floor to make it look like we were looking for drugs. Eduardo was waiting for us outside. He was supposed to be keeping watch on Dr. Fielding so he could let us know if the doctor was returning to his office, but Eduardo had lost Dr. Fielding and he was nervous. A police car appeared as we drove away, and it trailed behind us for 3 or 4 blocks. I thought to myself that the police car was protecting us. That is the feeling you have when you are doing operations for the government. You think that every step has been taken to protect you. Back at the hotel, Barker, Felipe, and I felt very bad. It was our first opportunity and we had failed. We hadn't found anything. Yes, I know, but they don't know it, Eduardo said, and he congratulated us all. He said, "Well done," and then he opened the bottle of champagne, and he told us, "This is a celebration. You deserve it." I told Diego and Barker that this had to have been a training mission for a very important mission to come, or else it was a cover operation. I thought to myself, maybe these people already had the papers of Ellsberg. Maybe Dr. Fielding had given them out, and for ethical reasons he needed to be covered. It seemed that these people already had what we were looking for, because no one invites you to have champagne and is happy when you fail. The whole thing was strange, but Eduardo was happy, so we were happy. He thanked us and we left for the airport. We took the plane back to Miami, and we never talked about this thing until we were all together in the District of Columbia jail. In Miami, I again told my CO about Eduardo. I was certain then that the company knew about his activities, but once again my CO did not pursue the subject. Meanwhile, Hunt started to do more and more things that convinced us of his important position in the White House. Once he called Barker and told him the president was about to mine Haiphong Harbor. He asked us to prepare letters and a rally of support in advance. It was very impressive to us when the announcement of the mining was made several days later. I made a point of telling my CO at our next meeting that Hunt was involved in some operations and that he was in the White House, even if they said he wasn't. After that, the CIA chief of the Western Hemisphere asked me for breakfast at Howard Johnson's on Biscayne Boulevard, and he said he was interested in finding out about Howard Hunt's activities. He wanted me to write a report. He said I should write it in my own hand, in Spanish, and give it to my CO in a sealed envelope. Right away, I went to see my CO. We were very close, my CO and I, and he told me that his father had once given him the advice that he should never put anything in writing that might do him any harm in the future. So I just wrote a cover story for the whole thing. I said that Hunt was in the Mullen Company, and the White House and things like that weren't important. What I really thought was that Hunt was checking to see if I could be trusted. Little by little, I watched Eduardo's operation grow. First, Barker was given $89,000 in checks from Mexican banks to cash for operational money, and then Eduardo told Barker to recruit 3 more men, including a key man. He signed up Frank Sturgis and Ronaldo Pico, and then Eduardo flew down to talk to our friend Virgilio Gonzalez, who was a locksmith, before recruiting him. Finally, orders come for us to report to Washington. The 6 of us arrived in Washington on May 22nd and checked into the Menger Hay Adams Hotel in time for Eduardo's first briefing. By that time, Liddy, whom we had known as George from the Fielding break-in, was taking a visible role in the planning. Eduardo had started calling him Daddy, and the 2 men seemed almost inseparable. We met McCord there for the first time. Eduardo said he was an old man from the CIA who used to do electronic jobs for the CIA and the FBI. We did not know his whole name. Eduardo just introduced him as Jimmy. He said we would be using walkie-talkies, and Jimmy was to be our electronics expert. There was also a boy there who had infiltrated the McGovern headquarters. There was no mention of Watergate at that meeting. Eduardo told us he had information that Castro and other foreign governments were giving money to McGovern, and we were going to find the evidence. The boy was going to help them break into the McGovern headquarters, but I did not pay much attention. They didn't need me for that operation, so I had some free time. During the day, I went off to see the different sites around Washington. I like those things, particularly the John Paul Jones Monument and the Naval Academy in Annapolis. Remember that prior to this, All of my operations for the United States were maritime. After 3 days, Eduardo aborted the McGovern operation. I think it was because the boy got scared. Anyway, Eduardo told us all to move into the Watergate Hotel to prepare for another operation. We brought briefcases and things like that to look elegant. We registered as members of the Emeritus Corporation of Miami, and then we met in Eduardo's room. Believe me, it was an improvised briefing. Eduardo told us he had information that Castro money was coming into the Democratic headquarters, not McGovern's, and that we were going to try to find the evidence there. Throughout the briefing, McCord, Liddy, and Eduardo would keep interrupting each other, saying, "Well, this way is better," or "that should be the other way around." It was not a very definite plan that was finally agreed upon, but you are not too critical of things when you think that people over you know what they are doing, when they are really professionals like Howard Hunt. The plan called for us to hold a banquet for the Emeritus Corporation in a private dining room of the Watergate. The room had access to the elevators that ran up to the 6th floor where the Democratic National Committee headquarters are located. Once the meal was underway, Eduardo was to show films and we were to take the elevator to the 6th floor and complete the mission. Gonzalez, our key man, was to open the door. Sturgis, Pico, and Felipe were to be lookouts. Barker was to get the documents. I was to take the photographs, and Jimmy, who was really McCord, was to do his job. We were all ready to go, but the people in the DNC worked late. Eduardo was drinking lots of milk. He has ulcers, so he was mixing his whiskey with the milk. We waited and waited. Finally, at 2 a.m., the night guard said we had to leave the banquet hall. So then there was a discussion. Eduardo said he would hide in the closet of the banquet room with Gonzalez, the key man, while the guard let the rest of us out. As soon as the coast was clear, they would let us back in. But then they couldn't open the door. It is difficult for me to tell you this story. I do not want it to become a laughing matter. More than 30 people are in jail already, and a lot of people are suffering. I spent more than 15 months in jail, and you must understand that this is a tragedy. It is not funny. But you can imagine Eduardo, ahead of the mission, in the closet. He did not sleep the whole night. It was really a disaster. So, more briefings, and we decided to go the next night. This time, the plan was to wait until all the lights had gone out on the 6th floor of the Watergate, and then go in through the front door. They gave us briefcases, and I remembered that there was a customs tag hanging on Eduardo's case, so I pulled it off for him. He got real mad. He said that every time he did something, he did it with a purpose. I could not see the purpose. But then, I don't know, maybe the tag had an open sesame command to let us in the doors. Anyway, all 7 of us in McCord's army walked up to the Watergate complex at midnight. McCord rang the bell, and the policeman came and let us in. We all signed the book, and McCord told the man we were going to the Federal Reserve office on the 8th floor. It all seemed funny to me. 8 men going to work at midnight. Imagine, we sat there talking to the police. Then we went up to the 8th floor, walked down to the 6th, and do you believe it? We couldn't open that door, and we had to cancel the operation. I don't believe it has ever been told before, but all the time while we were working on the door, McCord would be going to the 8th floor. It is still a mystery to me what he was doing there. At 2 a.m., I went up to tell him about our problems, and there I saw him talking to 2 guards. What happened, I thought. Have we been caught? No. He knew the guards, so I did not ask questions, but I thought maybe McCord was working there. It was the only thing that made sense. He was the one who led us to the place, and it would not have made sense for us to have rooms at the Watergate and go on this operation if there was not someone there on the inside. Anyway, I joined the group, and pretty soon we picked up our briefcases and walked out the front door. Eduardo was furious that Gonzalez hadn't been able to open the door. Gonzalez explained he didn't have the proper equipment, so Eduardo told him to fly back to Miami to get his other tools. Before he left the next day, Barker told Gonzalez that he might have to pay for his own flight back to Miami. I really got mad and told Barker I resented the way they were treating Gonzalez. I was a little hard with Barker. I said there wasn't adequate operational preparation. There was no floor plan of the building. No one knew the disposition of the elevators, how many guards there were, or even what time the guards checked the building. Gonzalez did not know what kind of door he was supposed to open. There weren't even any contingency plans. Barker came back to me with a message from Eduardo. You are an operative. Your mission is to do what you are told and not to ask questions. Gonzalez got back from Miami that night with his whole shop. I've never seen so many tools to open a door. No door could hold him. This time, everything worked. Gonzalez and Sturgis picked the lock in the garage exit door. Once inside, they opened the other doors and called over the walkie-talkie. The horse is in the house. Then they let us in. I took a lot of photographs, maybe 30 or 40, showing lists of contributors that Barker had handed me. Ford worked on the phones. He said his first 2 taps might be discovered, but not the third. With our mission accomplished, we went back to the hotel. It was about 5 a.m. Eduardo said he was happy. But this time, there was no champagne. He said we should leave for Miami right away. I gave him the film I had taken, and we left for the airport. There were things that bothered me about the operation, but I was satisfied. It is rare that you are able to check the effect of your work in the intelligence community. You know, they don't tell you if something you did is very significant. But we had taken a lot of pictures of contributions, and I had hopes that we might have done something valuable. We all had heard rumors in Miami that McGovern was receiving money from Castro. That was nothing new. We believe that today. A couple of weeks later, I was talking with Felipe de Diego and Frank Sturgis at our real estate office when Barker burst in like a cyclone. Eduardo had been in town, and he had given Barker some film to have developed and enlarged. Barker did not know what the film was, and he had taken it to a regular camera shop, and then Eduardo had told him it was the film from the Watergate operation. Barker was really excited. He needed us to come with him to get it back. So we went to Rich's camera shop, and Barker told Frank and me to cover each door to the shop in case the police came while he was inside. I do not think he handled the situation very well. There were all these people, and he was so excited, he ended up tipping the man at the store $20 or $30. The man had just enlarged the pictures showing the documents being held by a gloved hand, and he said to Barker, "It's real cloak and dagger stuff, isn't it?" Later, that man went to the FBI and told them about the film. My reaction was that it was crazy to have those important pictures developed in a common place in Miami. But Barker was my close friend, and I could not tell him how wrong the whole thing was. The thing about Barker was that he trusted Eduardo totally. He had been his principal assistant at the Bay of Pigs, Eduardo's liaison with the Cubans, and he still believed tremendously in this man. He was just blind about him. It was too much for me. I talked it over with Felipe and Frank and decided I could not continue. I was about to write a letter when Barker told me Eduardo wanted us to get ready for another operation in Washington. When you are in this kind of business, and you are in the middle of something, it is not easy to stop. Everyone will feel that you might jeopardize the operation. What to do with this guy now? I knew it would create a big problem, so I agreed to go on this last mission. Eduardo told us to buy surgical gloves and 40 rolls of film with 36 exposures on a roll. Imagine, that meant 1,440 photographs. I told Barker it would be impossible to take all those pictures. But it did seem to mean that what we got before encouraged Eduardo to go back for more. We flew into the national airport about noon on June 16th, and Barker and I went off to rent a car. In the airport lobby, Frank Sturgis ran into Jack Anderson, whom he had known since the Bay of Pigs when Anderson wrote a column about him as a soldier adventurer. Frank introduced Gonzalez to Anderson, and he gave him some kind of excuse about why he was in town. On our way to the Watergate, we made some jokes about the car Barker had rented. It gave me a premonition of a hearse. The mission was not one I was looking forward to. Eduardo was waiting for us at the Watergate. This time he had 2 operations planned, and we were supposed to perform them both that night. There was no time for anything. It was all rush. We went to eat at about 5 o'clock. Barker ate a lot, and when he came back, he felt really bad. I was not feeling too good myself. I had just gotten my divorce that day, and had gone from the court to the airport, and from the airport to the Watergate. The environment in each one of us was different. The whole thing was bad. There was tension in those people. Liddy was already in the room when Eduardo came in to give the briefing. Eduardo was wearing loafers and black pants with white stripes. They were very shiny. Liddy was not happy with those pants. He criticized them in front of us and he told Eduardo to go change them. So Eduardo went and changed his pants. The briefing he gave when he came back was very simple. He said we were going to photograph more documents at the Democratic headquarters and then move on to another mission at the McGovern headquarters after that. McCord was critical of the second operation. He said he didn't like the plan. It was very rare to hear McCord talking because usually he didn't say anything, and when he did talk, he only whispered. Before we left, Eduardo took all of our identification. He put it in a briefcase and left it in our room. He gave Sturgis his Edward J. Hamilton identification that the CIA had provided to him before, and he gave us each $200 in cash. He said we should use it as a bribe to get away if we were caught. Finally, he told us to keep the keys to our room where he had left the identification. I don't know why. Even today, I don't know. Remember, I was told in advance not to ask about those things. McCord went into the Watergate very early in the evening. He walked right through the front door of the office complex, signed the book, and I'm sure went to the 8th floor as he had before. Then he taped the doors from the 8th floor to the bottom floor and walked out through the exit door in the garage. It was still very early, and we were not going to go in until after everyone left the offices. We waited so long that Eduardo went out to check if the tapes were still there. He said they were, but when we finally got ready to go in, Vigilio and Sturgis noticed that the tape was gone and a sack of mail was at the door. So we said, well, the tape has been discovered. We'll have to abort the operation. But McCord thought we should go anyway. He went upstairs and tried to convince Liddy and Eduardo that we should go ahead. Before making a decision, they went to the other room. I believe they made a phone call, and Eduardo told us to go ahead. McCord did not come in with us. He said he had to go someplace. We never knew where he was going. Anyway, he was not with us, so when Vigilio picked the locks to let us in, we put tape on the doors for him and went upstairs. 5 minutes later, McCord came in, and I asked him right away, "Did you remove the tapes?" He said, "Yes, I did." But he did not, because the tape was later found by the police. Once inside, McCord told Barker to turn off his walkie-talkie. He said there was too much static, so we were there without communications. Soon we started hearing noises, people going up and down. McCord said it was only the people checking like before, but then there was running and men shouting, "Come out with your hands up or we will shoot," and things like that. There was no way out. We were caught. The police were very rough with us, pushing us around, tying our arms. But Barker was able to turn on his walkie-talkie, and he asked where the police were from. And then he said, "Oh, you are the Metropolitan policemen who catch us." So Barker was cool. He did a good job in advising Eduardo we were caught. I thought right away it was a setup, or something like that, because it was so easy the first time. We all had that feeling. They took our keys and found the identification in the briefcase Eduardo had left in our room. McCord was the senior officer, and he took charge. He was talking loudly now. He told us not to say a thing. "Don't give your names, nothing. I know people. Don't worry, someone will come and everything will be all right. This thing will be solved." According to an article published at Intrepid Report, December 18th, 2014, entitled "The Tragic Ends of the CIA's Madams," Wayne Madsen explains that many of you may be familiar with the late D.C. Madam Deborah Jean Palfrey, who reportedly committed suicide in 2008 prior to her revealing more details about her top-flight clientele, which ranged from Vice President Dick Cheney to top officials of the Central Intelligence Agency. most have likely never heard of Heidi Reichen. Decades before Palfrey arranged trysts paid for by the CIA, between her Pamela Martin and Associates escorts and visiting Arab sheiks and foreign oil company executives, Reichen plied the same trade for Langley from her headquarters on the 6th floor of the Columbia Plaza apartment complex, next door to the ill-famed Watergate Hotel and condominium. Palfrey bought an apartment in East Berlin at a bargain basement price, said to have been arranged by the number 3 CIA man, Kyle Dusty Foggo, who was later imprisoned for fraud. The apartment was reportedly a former CIA safe house that Foggo was ordered to sell. Reichen, a former Army private who used her actual name, Adelheid Charlotte Reichen, while she was on active duty in Germany in Fort Myer, Virginia, across the Potomac from Washington, D.C., was born in Germany. After leaving the Army, the attractive blonde became a popular stripper along the old 14th Street corridor of strip clubs just a few blocks from the White House. After hooking up with notorious D.C. mob boss Joe Nessline, Erica Heidi Reichen, as she was known, began working for another notorious outfit, the CIA. As with Palfrey's Pamela Martin and Associates, Reichen had a corporate cover called Business Services Consultants, located at 5101 River Road, Suite 415, Bethesda, Maryland. Reichen's business cards listed her as Erica L. Reichen. According to the book White House Call Girl, The Real Watergate Story by Phil Stanford, Heidi also used the name Kathy Dieter, especially when she was doing business with her Columbia Plaza business partner, one James McCord of McCord Associates. McCord was one of the burglars of the Democratic National Committee at the Watergate and a top CIA surveillance expert. McCord also happened to videotape trysts between Heidi's call girls and leading D.C. celebrities and politicians. It is not known who was actually taped and which tapes made their way into the hands of Richard Helms at the CIA, but Heidi's Black Book included 2 key members of the Senate Watergate Committee that was investigating the Nixon White House, Senator Lowell Weicker and Sam Dash, the Democratic counsel for the committee, whose unlisted phone number was in Heidi's book. Also in Heidi's Black Book was Nixon aide and chief committee witness against the president, John Dean, Dean's wife, Maureen Mo Biner Dean, sometimes referred to with the code name of Clout in Heidi's Black Book, Nixon aide, Jeb Magruder, and a number of professional football players, including the Washington Redskins' Sonny Jurgensen and Ed Kyatt, the Dallas Cowboys' Don Meredith and Lance Rensel, and the Green Bay Packers' Paul Hornung, as well as team owners Clint Murchison Jr. of the Cowboys and Art Modell of the Cleveland Browns. Reichen's and McCord's operation at the Columbia Plaza was the main base from which Chief White House plumber G. Gordon Liddy, McCord, and E. Howard Hunt, along with 3 Cuban CIA contractors, launched their bugging operation against DNC headquarters at the Watergate. McCord and Liddy set up their surveillance nest at the nearby Howard Johnson's Hotel, across the street from the Watergate. It is now assumed that Nixon aides were interested in seizing a list DNC Chairman Larry O'Brien maintained of blackmailed customers of Heidi's ring, which included DNC officials as well as top Nixon aides. While carrying out some dubious tasks in Antigua involving casinos for the Meyer-Lansky-connected Nessline, Heidi became more involved with the dark side of the mob-CIA relationship. One of the names listed in Heidi's Black Book was Alvin Kotz, a gambling gangster from Potomac, Maryland. From 2002 to 2004, Kotz ran an offshore gambling operation called Worldwide Wagering Incorporated, headquartered in Dominica in the Caribbean. In 2005, Kotz was sentenced to 3 years in federal prison for running the gambling racket. Heidi also had interaction with a number of figures linked to the assassination of President John F. Kennedy, including Texas businessman Clint Murchison Jr., principal owner of the Dallas Cowboys and son of Clint Murchison Sr., the Texas oil baron Joe Campisi, the owner of Campisi's Egyptian restaurant in Dallas, who reportedly hosted Jack Ruby, Lee Oswald, Dallas cop J.D. Tippit, and others at a November 21, 1963 dinner while Murchison Sr. was hosting a party for J. Edgar Hoover, Richard Nixon, H. L. Hunt, Fort Worth millionaire Sid Richardson, and Vice President Lyndon Johnson. Heidi's Black Book includes phone numbers for Fred Black, LBJ's neighbor and close friend of Bobby Baker, and Morris Jaffe, LBJ's financial advisor. As with Palfrey, Heidi's ultimate successor in the CIA's call girl operations, Riken was left out to dry after the Watergate affair and downfall of Nixon. In 1978, it is reported that Heidi, while drunk, tripped down a flight of stairs in Reading, Pennsylvania, and died. We are also led to believe that after being convicted on mail fraud and other criminal counts, Palfrey committed suicide by hanging herself in her elderly mother's home in Tarpon Springs, Florida. Of course, the CIA would never think of simply eliminating two women who had enough information on the sexual peccadillos of America's most powerful leaders to shake the American political system to the ground. Just as the muddy concept behind the Watergate scandal begins to clear, yet another compelling thread reveals itself in the form of Fiona Barnett, author of Eyes Wide Open and a victim of child abuse herself. She claims to have been a former MKUltra and CIA mind control survivor who was swept into a global child trafficking network and pedophile blackmail operation by the CIA and the Australian military. Her alleged abuse involved sophisticated mind control, weaponized occult practices, satanic ritual abuse, and deliberately induced DID, dissociative identity disorder, through trauma-based forced dissociation. Fiona Barnett penned an article for Geopolitics that covers much of the first chapter in her book and seems to provide a new window into the dark reality behind Watergate, while simultaneously drawing connections between some of the most prominent child abuse scandals in recent memory. Barnett explains that in October 2016, I presented at a trauma and dissociation conference in Seattle. Following my talk, one attendee approached me in the hotel lobby where my fellow presenters sat at their merchandise stalls. "All this," she shouted while sweeping her arm across the sideshow alley of overpriced books, stickers, and fridge magnets. "All this is shit. You have the real stuff. Where's your book?" Tears welled in her eyes. "Write a book. Please write a book." Yes, I have the real stuff. I'm not some arrogant academic pretending to understand what it's like to be a victim of the most heinous crimes. I lived it. I spent my developmental years trapped in a mind control labyrinth. I then spent my adult years navigating my way out. I eventually achieved what few victims have: true integration. I may therefore declare with authority what does and does not work. I prefer the term victim to survivor because the latter implies my ordeal is over. My ordeal will likely never end. As Dr. Raina Michelson warned, "Fiona, I think this is a life sentence." I serve a life sentence for crimes committed against me, with the full knowledge and blessing of the Australian government. I am constantly harassed by police, paid agitators, pedophile payroll academics and journalists, DID sleeper cells, perpetrator relatives, fake victims, fake advocates, professional social media trolls, and retired intelligence community thugs hired to do the dirty work of the VIP pedophiles who dare not overly attack me, since that would attract media attention to their role in the international child trafficking operation. Recovery from extreme abuse begins with realizing the true nature and extent of international child trafficking. In 2015, a certain journalist wrote favorable articles about me concerning my Sydney press conference. I subsequently phoned and asked him to investigate and publish my full story. If only one mainstream journalist published my testimony against Anthony Kidman, I reasoned, it would blow the international child trafficking network wide open. During this call, he relayed a conversation he once had with a couple of spooks who told him that all senior politicians are pedophiles because that is how they are controlled. He asked me if that was my story. That's exactly right. That's consistent with my experience. I tried to contain my excitement. The mainstream media has long documented the CIA's involvement in drugs and weapon trafficking, right? He agreed, noting there had just been another story about that in the mainstream press. Well, then, is it so hard to imagine they are also involved in trafficking children, which is far more lucrative than guns and drugs? ASIO and the CIA work together to traffic children between Australia and America. They're the ones who trafficked me. The journalist promised to consider my request, bearing in mind he had a young family and publishing my story would surely place them at risk. But he never got back to me. A short time later, he suddenly developed a rare and aggressive form of cancer. I called him, expressed my condolences, and we chatted for a bit. At the end of the conversation, I mentioned I was considering writing a book. I asked him to clarify and elaborate on what he told me of his encounter with the spooks. I never said that, he bluntly asserted. I sighed in resignation. It was over. There went my last chance at breaking into the mainstream media. There went years of building rapport and credibility with mainstream journalists, years of investigating other abuse cases and passing my findings on to television and newspapers, years of driving journalists around the district to meet the victims themselves, years of results in other cases. The Gold Coast hogtie doctor story went international, with Neville Davis being permanently banned from practicing medicine in Australia, although that doesn't stop him setting up shop in Thailand. Gary Willis's 20-year child abuse spree ended with a permanent ban on his teaching for the NSW Education Department, although that didn't stop him from working for Education Queensland at Talabudgera Primary School. And NSW police were forced to do a mop-up investigation of Daruk Boys' home after sensational headlines about a victim having his penis cut off went global, although they left out the bit where Daruk boys were trafficked to VIP pedophiles at King's Cross child brothels. I had come so close. My 2015 press conference was statistically the most popular story on the Sydney Morning Herald website that day, even though their computer technicians refused to list it as the most viewed article. The USA National Enquirer intended to run a front-page story about Anthony Kidman being a pedophile until they received a vicious letter from Nicole's lawyers. A journalist and her photographer husband flew up from Sydney to interview me for a major Australian magazine until Nicole, who had lucrative contracts with Sydney's media outlets, took a Scientology approach to managing me. Finally, a UK journalist traveled around the country interviewing me and two other victims of Anthony Kidman for the Daily Mail Online, until one of the victims, whose parents were Anthony Kidman's personal friends, threatened and subsequently withdrew last minute. Despite everything the pedophile network threw at me, my story still got out there such that if you Google Anthony Kidman's name, the words child abuse soon follow. Once Nicole Kidman's PR team shut down my mainstream media exposure by drawing on Kidman's lucrative contracts with every Australian media outlet, I turned to the internet. Armed with a simple meme app and a talent for lyric writing, I launched my own social media campaign. I spent years in front of the computer, communicating with hundreds of victims and supporters, many fake, many genuine. I hit the conspiracy theory jackpot when David Icke featured an enormous photograph of me in my story on his Australian speaking tour. My tactics worked. Online articles about Nicole Kidman, where the public was free to leave negative comments, were followed by streams of intelligent attacks on her orchestrated stardom. I realized my impact when Kidman's PR team paid a newspaper and a morning television show to feature an article tellingly titled, "Shame on you, Australia. Stop hating on Nicole Kidman." People don't hate Nicole as an individual. They hate what the Harvey Weinstein scandal later highlighted, that Hollywood rewards something other than an ability to sing, dance, or act. Hollywood rewards loyalty to their pedophile system. But no amount of alternative media success can match a complete break into mainstream, so I admitted defeat. I stopped posting and even checking my sites. Days before the 2016 US presidential election, I received a barrage of texts from old friends asking if I was okay. People started inquiring about our family's welfare. I had no idea what was happening. Then I checked my blog site. A spike of 100,000 views in one day stemmed from an article that activist group Anonymous published about my being trafficked to American VIPs. They used my story to undermine Hillary Clinton's candidacy and expose her involvement in a child sex trafficking ring. The Clinton Foundation was a front for the trafficking of children, including Haiti earthquake victims. Bill and Hillary's trafficking network implicated her campaign chairman John Podesta. Podesta and his brother Tony were staying in a villa owned by UK politician Sir Clement Freud near British child Madeleine McCann when she disappeared in Portugal. Clement was Sigmund Freud's grandson, who was outed in mainstream British media as a pedophile. John and Tony Podesta perfectly matched the identikit images Scotland Yard released of Madeleine's abductors. Pedogate, as the scandal became known, surfaced when WikiLeaks released emails from John Podesta's account in October 2016. The emails notably outed Hillary Clinton as a self-confessed Moloch worshipper and captured politicians ordering children for pedophile parties using fast food code words. The White House, for instance, made a massive fast food order, contravening policy dictating all food be prepared on-site using raw ingredients to counter the security risk posed by externally prepared foods. The trafficked kids were held in transit cellars within local Washington, D.C. businesses, including a restaurant where a drag entertainer was caught on tape boasting about raping and killing kids. Clean FBI and NYPD officers made multiple attempts to charge Clinton and other VIP members of the trafficking ring, but their efforts were typically thwarted by those above them in the chain of command. Mainstream media giants launched a cover-up campaign against the leaked Podesta emails. The likes of CNN, founded by one of my pedophile rapists, Ted Turner, successfully drew the public's attention from what was contained in the emails to who might have leaked them and spread fake news. Clinton herself never addressed or denied the emails' contents. The emails were in fact leaked by U.S. intelligence community staff who opposed organized pedophilia. Mainstream journalists who reported the truth of the matter were promptly fired. Dozens of Clinton's staff and associates met untimely deaths in quick succession. So Pedogate, or Pizzagate, was discredited as fake news despite NBC's June 11, 2013 televised report regarding Hillary Clinton using her position as U.S. Secretary of State to cease an investigation into child sex trafficking within the State Department. Pedogate reached the public via social media. YouTube featured interviews with credible witnesses who testified to the existence of an international child sex trafficking operation involving U.S. politicians and the CIA. That was when I noticed retired NYPD Detective James Rothstein. The Pedogate ring, he explained, was the same network he investigated for 35 years. Rothstein observed the perpetrators were doing everything in their power to shut the Pedogate story down. He predicted the perpetrators would successfully bury it, like every other time their network was almost exposed. Rothstein explained that the NYPD was no ordinary state police force, but a leading investigative agency with national and international offices. Back in 1966, Rothstein became the first police detective assigned to investigate the prostitution industry. He soon discovered the underground sexual blackmail operation that compromised politicians with child prostitutes. Human compromise is the term he uses for this honey trap process. Rothstein and his colleagues found that up to 70% of top U.S. government leaders had been compromised. The CIA conducted the human compromise operation, while the FBI's task was to cover it up. James Rothstein was alerted to an identical VIP pedophile ring operating in the UK when British intelligence consulted him regarding the Profumo affair. MI6 agents visited Rothstein in New York to extract what he knew about the British politicians and other VIPs having sex with child prostitutes. This was part of their effort to cover up the true pedophile nature of the Profumo scandal. Rothstein found the international pedophile rings are connected, and that their members meet at various world locations where each destination catered for a different type of degenerate sexual proclivity, including satanic-themed abuse. Rothstein and his colleagues encountered fierce resistance to the investigation and prosecution of members of the child trafficking operation. His investigative journalist contacts at the New York Times and Washington Post could not get stories about the VIP pedophile ring printed. All police, FBI, customs, and IRS officers who pursued the VIP pedophile network above street level had their careers subsequently destroyed. Rothstein's attempts to arrest key perpetrators were continually thwarted. The choice example is when he served the head of the CIA's human compromise operation, Tippy Richardson. According to pedophile-turned-police informant Ben Rose, in November 1971, Tippy Richardson, businessman Leonard Stewart from OPEC, Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries, and a surgeon named Dr. Chesky, raped and murdered 3 boys aged 14 to 15 years in Rose's apartment on East 64th Street in New York City. The New York State Select Committee on Crime subsequently served subpoenas on both Tippy Richardson and Leonard Stewart. When served, Richardson said that because he worked for the CIA, the subpoena would be withdrawn under the National Security Act by the time Rothstein and his colleagues returned to their offices. It was. In 1972, Rothstein arrested one of the 5 Watergate burglars, CIA operative Frank Sturgis. During a subsequent 2-hour interrogation, he discovered the truth about Watergate. Burglars sought something they nicknamed the Book, which listed the Democrat and Republican politicians who accessed child prostitutes, their sexual proclivities, and the amounts they paid to rape kids. The official Watergate explanation is that the Republicans broke into Democratic National Committee headquarters to obtain information about their election strategies. People who lived through Watergate typically comment with a frown. That never made sense. Rothstein's experiences make better sense of why Nixon conspired to quash the Watergate investigation, why he suggested the investigation posed a threat to national security, why his personal secretary destroyed Oval Office tape recordings after they were subpoenaed, and why his own vice president issued a pardon which protected him from prosecution for any crimes he had committed or may have committed or taken part in as president. If Nixon's crimes included pedophilia, that would make perfect sense. I am confident President Richard Nixon and his good buddy, the Reverend Billy Graham, were named in the Watergate pedophile records because I was sex trafficked to both men as a young child. When I spoke with James Rothstein, he said he had not heard that Nixon was a pedophile, but that he certainly knew from multiple victims Reverend Billy Graham was a rampant pedophile. Rothstein also told me that during his investigations, he became aware of an identical child sex trafficking ring in Australia involving prime ministers. Although he never directly investigated it himself, he said Peter Osborne, who worked in Australian intelligence, knew the details. He also confirmed that Australian politicians and other VIPs attended international child brothels. Another voice to surface in the wake of the Pedogate scandal was Dutch banker Ronald Bernard. Bernard shed further light on the people and system behind the international child trafficking network during a series of interviews with Irma Schiffers. Bernard said he worked in international finance and high-end money laundering for 12 years. There he discovered that political power does not reside with publicly elected representatives, but with the world's 8,000 to 8,500 wealthiest individuals who exercise power behind the scenes and who routinely manipulate the media. These people, he explained, sit at the top of a power structure that resembles a pyramid. Directly beneath them sits the Bank for International Settlements, BIS. Below the BIS sit the IMF, International Monetary Fund, and the World Bank. Below them sit the central banks, which are illegally created private banks which oversee the commercial banking system of their respective countries. Below these sit the multinational companies, and finally sit the country's governments. Bernard said the wealthiest 8,000 to 8,500 people created the BIS in 1930. Since the world's richest individuals are too young to have helped establish the BIS 88 years ago, he must be referring to banking dynasties like the Rothschilds. In a chapter titled Banking and the World's Biggest Business, the book Dope Inc., Britain's Opium War Against the U.S., lists the Rothschilds as one of the 9 family dynasties responsible for the modern drug industry, which they assert is run as a single integrated world operation from the opium poppy to the nickel bag of heroin sold on the inner city corner. The current global drug trade was established by the British Crown during the Opium Wars, when P&O steam lines were founded to transport the drugs. The HSBC Bank was established to launder the proceeds, and the court Rothschilds were employed to financially manage the operation. Apparently, little has changed, and the same operation has simply been expanded. There must have been some truth to the content of Dope Inc., because its revelations resulted in the HSBC Bank losing its license to operate in the U.S. The book also inspired law enforcement officials to swap their assumption that drug trafficking consisted of pockets of independent criminal activity for the fact it is a global network coordinated by the CIA, with proceeds laundered through banks and funneled into the CIA's covert terrorist operations. This is the very system Ronald Bernard described. He said his own laundering operation dealt with governments, multinationals, terrorist organizations, and secret services. Secret service agencies, he specified, do not serve and protect a people or country as the public expect. Instead, they are all criminal organizations that trade in drugs, weapons, and children. According to Bernard, the wealthy elites controlled their employees by compromising and blackmailing them, just like James Rothstein said. The best way to understand the child trafficking industry is to trace the history of the drug trafficking industry. As you read Dope Inc., cross out each occurrence of the word drugs and replace it with the word kids. This will give you a picture of the child trafficking network that victimized me. Like the drug trade, the child sex trafficking industry is run by the very same people as a single integrated world operation. At the top of this sit the wealthy elite who maintain control by ensuring only blackmailed, compromised politicians, military brass, and government officials occupy leadership. Secret services, including ASIO, the CIA, and British intelligence, coordinate the child trafficking and human compromise operation, receive the victims procured via the little men, train these into suitable assets, and transport the victims nationally and internationally to service VIP pedophiles. Australia is in the process of 2 federal investigations: the Royal Commission into Institutional Response to Child Abuse and the Royal Commission into Misconduct in the Banking, Superannuation, and Financial Services industry. Only one of these investigations has shed any light on the global child trafficking network I personally reported to the Child Abuse Royal Commission. On April 5, 2018, the newly appointed head of AUSTRC, Australian Transaction Reports and Analysis Centre, told the ABC News, "I thought coming from the Australian Criminal Intelligence Commission that I had a pretty good handle on serious and organized crime. I didn't appreciate the depth and breadth of involvement with private entities and banks. I didn't appreciate how many industries it does actually touch. There's a misperception that money laundering is a victimless white-collar crime that's probably just looking at tax avoidance. And it's not. It's criminal entities using financial institutions here and nationally to move criminal funds around our country and our financial system overseas. And it has a massive impact on everyday life, whether that's child exploitation, serious and organized crime, drug importation. It all involves money laundering." Australia's Commonwealth Bank was subsequently fined $700 million for near 54,000 breaches of anti-money laundering and anti-terrorism financing laws, including the laundering of proceeds from child sex trafficking and the channeling of funds into overseas terrorist organizations. So my very own bank, which wooed my kitty custom with a green tin money box painted to resemble a building, simultaneously facilitated my child abuse. In short, late U.S. President Richard Nixon was probably looking for evidence of malfeasance by the high-ranking Democratic Party leadership, and as a retaliation, was made the ultimate fall guy in order to save the organization from falling. His fall from grace was a compromise between a JFK-like assassination and an early retirement. Meanwhile, the conviction of the Vatican treasurer Cardinal Pell, an Australian pedophile touted to be the handler of the incumbent white Pope Bergoglio, and the mass resignations of the bankers in 2012, which culminated in the unprecedented resignation of Pope Benedict in 2013, are proof enough that the oligarchy criminal cabal has been experiencing a massive crackdown in its globalized satanic operations. All we need to do now is to stay with the present course, inform as much people as we can that all is not lost about our humanity after all, reject negativity in all forms of discourse. That's part of their favorite staple, to smear the messenger rather than the message. In the end, as is always the case, nothing is what it seems, and we can no longer afford to accept things at face value as the prevailing narrative has once more collapsed around us. The Watergate scandal is an elaborate cover story intended to disguise a sadistic state-sponsored sexual blackmail operation compromising individuals at the highest levels of government for decades. Every scandal since Watergate has often been facetiously labeled with the same terminology or gate suffix in a deceitful and underhanded attempt to convince the vast majority of people to inherently dismiss these abhorrent crimes of state, intentionally conflating them by analogy with the infamous Watergate scandal. Yet again, we're forcefully confronted with an all too familiar emotional state of fear and loathing generated by this shadow cabal pulling the strings. The one duty we owe to history, said Oscar Wilde, is to rewrite it.